guys remember back in 2020, 2021, when the COVID tests, your first take-home COVID tests, when they first came out? And I remember, like, you start to feel like those symptoms of a cold, and they're starting to grow and that kind of thing. And so, based upon what was happening with COVID, you decide to take a test and just to kind of see. And of course, you're hoping, maybe that's beyond hope. Okay, there's hope, and then there's hoping. But but you're hoping that it'll just be one line, right? You're hoping that it will just be one line. There's a story, before I go further, there's a story of a woman that she goes to her husband, and she says, "Look at this." And he looks at it, it's a pregnancy test. And he looks at it, he grabs it, and he's so excited because she's positive, like she's pregnant, and he grabs her and he kisses her on the lips, and he's jumping up and down. "We're going to have a baby, we're going to have a baby, we're going to have a baby." And she goes, "That's my COVID test. I just tested positive." Kind of thing. But with the COVID test, you were hoping, because back then, when they were still trying to figure it out, and especially before they figured out like the vaccines and that kind of thing, and how to be able to navigate it, when you got that second line, there were some huge implications, right? Part of it was you'd have to quarantine, so you wouldn't be able to go into work if you were going to work. So you had to deal with that. Then you also had to deal with, the stresses of like losing vacation time or vacation days. You had to wrestle with that, and how's this going to affect me financially? But most importantly, probably the bigger challenge was, is this a death sentence for me? Like, that was kind of the fear, that we were wrestling with. So having a cold is bad news. It's kind of annoying. But going from a cold to COVID is like worse, isn't it? It's just going from bad to worse. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but right now we're doing a series called Living the Dream. And in this series, what we're doing is we're kind of doing a follow-up of a previous series that we had did of why does life suck sometimes. We did a series on that, and we were talking about how important it is for us to be able to learn how to lament and bring our trials, our hardships, our problems to God and be able to work through them with God. And so with Living the Dream, what we decided to do is to kind of look at a case study. Is there someone in Scripture that we can look at that went through terrible things, and how did they navigate them, and how can we learn from their life? And so in this series, what we're doing is we're looking at the life of a guy named Joseph. And just kind of recognizing just some of the things he had to go through. So far in this series, the first week we looked at the fact that God has a dream for you. He really does. He has a dream for you. There's a reason why you exist. There's a purpose for your existence. And so we encourage you to take steps to begin to find out what that dream was. And then last week, we looked at what happens when our dream faces our first obstacle, our hindrance, our challenge. And so, with Joseph, we looked at, his brothers and how his brothers sold him into slavery. Now, I just want to tell you, I understand sibling rivalry. I totally get it. But selling your brother or your sister into slavery is probably not the way to handle it. I just want to let you know. But that's what they did. And so we looked at how Joseph just kind of navigated through that. And so also what we began to look at over this is the situation, because we said last week at the end of the message that Joseph's situation goes from bad to worse. And we kind of talked about Potiphar, because the name of so Joseph is sold into slavery. I guess the name of his slave master would be a guy named Potiphar. And Potiphar had seen like God be with Joseph in incredible ways. So he began to trust Joseph with responsibilities and that kind of thing. It was really great. And we also saw that God was with Joseph in the midst of slavery. A lot of times we think God is going to be with me when I get that deliverance, when things work out, when things overcome, when I finally get that freedom, when I finally get that breakthrough. That means that God is with me. And we were saying that in the midst of his slavery, that Joseph was able to recognize that God was with him and that God had blessed him and God was still working. And so one of the things that we talked about last week is, do we miss the presence of God because we're so focused on the deliverance of God. So if you missed last week, make sure you go back and watch that as well. But as we begin to dig into today, we said that, again, Joseph's situation goes from bad to worse. Now, if you remember last week, we talked about Potiphar, and we said Potiphar's wife had taken a liking to Joseph. And when I say a liking to Joseph, I mean she took a liking to Joseph. Kind of. So much so that she wanted Joseph to, jump her bones. Can I say that in church? Well, I did. I can't take it back. But she's like, Joseph, sleep with me. And Joseph was like, no, no. And so as a result of that, what happens is Joseph wants to honor God so much and honor her and honor his slave master that he just runs out of the room and leaves his cloak. Just runs and leaves it. So then what happens then is Potiphar's wife creates a different narrative. And so she begins to talk about how Joseph tried to take advantage of her, that kind of thing. And this is just an observation. We're going to get back to Potiphar's wife in a moment. But this is just kind of an observation. Okay, so when Joseph is sold into slavery, he's wearing a coat. When Joseph is in a situation that goes from bad to worse, he's wearing a cloak. So I think Joseph should stop wearing clothes that start with C. So clogs are out, cardigan sweaters are out, and Joseph definitely don't wear those cutoff jeans. Just don't. So that's just an observation of mine. But she goes to her husband, and she talks about this elaborate story, and basically what does she do? She reinvents or she recreates the narrative. And have you had that experience too? Like you're dealing with people, and they change the narrative in the conversation, and you just get frustrated, right? Because now the narrative, the truth kind of becomes a moving target because they're changing the narrative, and that's what she's doing in this situation. But when she goes to her husband in Genesis chapter 39, verses 19 through 20, it says, Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into prison, where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. I want to emphasize that part. Remained. Because the idea of remaining means that you what? Remain. There's no opportunity to be able to get out. There's no no bail bondsman, that kind of thing, post bail. He remained, he was going to be there until Potiphar decided, you can come out now. That's the kind of thing. So he was stuck in prison. So that's why, again, he goes from slavery to now where he goes to prison. So now here's my question that I wanted to ask you is, how do you navigate when things go from bad to worse? How do you navigate that? I mean, you've been praying, and you pray for solution, you pray for resolution, you pray for things to work out, you pray, and then it gets worse. How do you navigate that? How do you deal with it? So I was on, as I was preparing for the message, and I just happened to put from bad to worse in the Google search line, kind of thing. And the source came up and started giving all these words. So I went to thesource.com and actually put in from bad to worse. And what I want to show you on the screen is this is what it came up with, from bad to worse. So to aggravate, annoy, inflame, irritate, provoke, embitter, enrage, and I love this one, envenom. You're mad when you are envenomed, but envenom, madden, vex, add insult to injury, fan the flames, feed the fire, push one's buttons, rattle one's cage, rub salt in a wound. Aren't those things that we feel when things go from bad to worse? Aren't they? Now let me tell you what this is not a message to say to you, well, don't feel what you're feeling. Don't feel what you're feeling, because that is not of God. Okay, this is not that message. What I want to encourage you to do is be honest with God. about what it is that you're feeling. Be honest with God about what it is that you're going through. Be honest with God about the fact that you are envenomed. And I'm going to say that like 7 more times in the message just because I like that word. But go to God and bring that to him. And so with that in mind, here's what I wanted to share. You can see this point right on the screen. And that is the worst reveals the substance and makeup of your faith. When you go through those challenges, when you go from bad to worse, it will reveal the substance and makeup of your faith. What are you grounded in? What are you founded upon? What are you built upon? How are you growing in your relationship with him? So bring that to him, but now also begin to examine like my faith and what I'm going through and how do I navigate this? You know, recently something that we went through, and now the story I'm going to tell you, when you think from bad to worse, you're going to be like, come on, Ken, that's not worse. So I'm just going to be honest with you. I recognize that as I tell this story, but it's my story. Okay, so with that in mind, one of the things I've always appreciated about my son, Xavier, my oldest, is that he is very strategic in his thinking. He really plans things out. And so he had a Toyota 4Runner before, and he just realized, like, going back to school at Cal Poly St. Louis, and he's home this weekend. Hey, X, sorry, I didn't mean to point you out, but I'm excited that you're here. But you know, he's talking about, like, going back to Cal Poly St. Louis Obispo, sorry, I need to slow down. You know, just to buy gas going there in a 4Runner, I mean, that could really be expensive. So he decided to sell his 4Runner, and, you know, got a good payment for it, and we decided to just, like, look for cars. And so we thought, like, looking for cars, it'd be nothing. Like, we look, boom, having one done in a day, we'd be good to go, right? 3 weeks later, you know, it was like, it was just one of those things. And I'll tell you, like, we went on Facebook Marketplace, and there would be some great cars that we would see, and then you'd pull up the Carfax. Praise God for Carfax. I mean, I'm just telling you now, whoever, it is a God-given gift. I just tell you that. So you go on Carfax, and I kid you not, like, people were rolling, a majority of the cars that we looked at had rolled back odometers. And one car was rolled back, not 5,000, not 10,000. One car was rolled back 40,000 miles. That's crazy, right? It's just crazy. And we would let them know, and they would still be on Facebook Marketplace listed at the same price, but hey, we're not getting that one. Because a lot of times what they do is they just hope people will just buy it and not check, kind of thing. So we looked at that was an option. Then we found a car that we thought would be great. It was a Toyota Corolla 2001. It only had like a little bit over 100,000 miles on it, and the guy was asking $6,000 for it. So we were going to meet with him and then just kind of negotiate the price down. So we went out to La Mirada to check the car out. They put it on the lift, and you know this is bad when a mechanic goes. You know that's not gonna be a good sign, right? So they started pointing out things. They gave us an estimate. Said this car needs about $5,700 worth of work. $5,700. We were like, oh, it's not that clean. You know? So we tried to negotiate with the guy, and he was like not coming down on the price. So we thought, okay, well, so it's not that car. So then on Thursday, I found two Scion TCs, because I think Xavier would like that car. So I found them. I went out to this lot in El Monte. So I get out to the lot in El Monte, and I go over to the first Scion, and I open it, and I look inside, and I'm like, I'm not sitting in that thing. Word of advice. If you're going to sell a car, detail it first. Right? At least like clean it. You know, I looked in the car and I was like, oh, there's no way I'm sitting in this thing. No way. So I was like, I can't get this for Xavier. This is terrible. But there was another Scion that was on the lot, and it was $1,000 cheaper, and it actually had 10,000 fewer miles. It was just a little bit older. So, well, let me look at that one. Walked around, looked at it. It looked cleaner and everything. So I said, well, I'll test drive this one. And so when I test drove it, that's when I knew we got to get Xavier a Scion TC because he would like the way it rides. But I get inside the car, and I'm starting to look around, and like the handles are starting to come off, and things are happening. And then I take the car out on the street and test drive it. And, the driver's side mirror, to check traffic and everything, every time I would accelerate, it'd go boop. And when I brake, it'd go boop. Kind of thing. So now I feel like as I'm driving, Sanford and Son, you guys remember that show? So, okay, all right, so I'll just move on. So I was like, I can't get this thing. And so we get back to the lot, and I get out of the car, and I'm pretty confident I'm not going to get it for Xavier because I just don't want to give him that kind of car. And to confirm it, the guy that owned the lot got in the car to pull it in the lot. When he closed the door, the mirror fell off of it, hit the ground, and broke. So I was like, okay, definitely not, no way. So like I said, I know that that's just a little minor thing, but it just kind of feels like, it is. When you're trying to do something and you feel like you're trying to do it the right way, it just feels annoying, doesn't it? And when things go from bad to worse, and I know that, like I said, compared to some of your stories, that's not a worse. I totally get that. But when things go from bad to worse, you do get frustrated. You do get envenomed, right? you do. So what can we learn from Joseph when it goes from bad to worse? So it says this in Genesis chapter 39, verse 21. It says, "But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden." Made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. And again, how many times do we miss out on the blessing because we're caught up in the messing? Sorry, I had to rhyme blessing, But how many times? How many times do we miss out on God? Because again, in this situation, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on God being with Joseph in the midst of the situation because we really dove into that last week. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But again, as we look at this, that obviously God was with Joseph, and I think sometimes what we do is when things go from bad to worse, we assume that means that God, you're not with me. Because how would you if you love me, don't we? If you love me, how could you let things go from bad to worse? That becomes our struggle, isn't it? And again, I want to say this because this is really important, and I'll say this, and you're going to hear me say this again as long as you come to Encounter, is I think as Christians we do not do suffering well. And I think one of the major reasons why is because of us as pastors and the message that we tell you. And we tell you things like, trust Jesus, believe in him, and everything's going to work out. All you need to do is pray, pray, pray. It'll all work out. Just pray. Or push, right? Pray until something happens. And if something happens, it gets worse. So how do we navigate that? So that's why I also do messages on suffering, because I want us to be able to look at suffering from a biblical perspective. And as a result of that, to be able to navigate it in such a way that as a result of it, we come out closer to God. We come up having grown. We come out having overcome. We come out having been able to face maybe the worst in life, maybe to face the worst in ourselves, and know that God was with me and I'm a better person. I'm a better person. Not necessarily because of the suffering, because I don't want that, but I'm a better person. And in that passage, it also says to us that God showed his faithful love. Now, do you feel like, do you see, I hope you feel like the tension in that. Because he just went from bad to worse. And it's saying in the midst of the worst that God showed his faithful love. Now think about that. Because for us, again, when we think things go from bad to worse, the last thing we think about is God's faithful love. We think his love is what? Unfaithful. We think he loves us less. We think he doesn't even care. But in the midst of that circumstance, there's two passages that I used to read. And I think as a result of preparing for this message, I see them differently now. And I want to share those two passages with you. The first one is Romans chapter 5, verse 3. It says, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance. We can rejoice? Wait. We can rejoice. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow, for when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing. Needing nothing. Now, I used to read these passages, and I would take them as looking for reasons to rejoice by finding the silver lining around the black cloud, right? I said black cloud. Yeah, all the people in the back are like, ha ha, okay, yeah. Black cloud. Or, when life has you lemons, make lemonade. When life has you lemon, make lemonade. So, with that though, I think Joseph teaches us something more about suffering. And that is that God is with me in the midst of my suffering. So I need to look for those moments where God is showing his favor still in the midst of my suffering. That he's showing his favor, that he's showing that he's at work. He's showing that he cares. He's showing that he's walking with me. So here's the question that we can ask ourselves. Can I love God and be confident that God loves me when things go from bad to worse? Can I love God and be confident that God loves me when things go from bad to worse? Because like I said, it is in those moments that we question God's love. It's in those moments that we begin to doubt. It's in those moments that we begin to wrestle. It's in those moments that our faith struggles. It's in the moments that our faith wrestles. And again, it's really bad, like I said, when things go from bad to worse. Things go from bad to worse. But let me ask you this question. What if you go through something hard and you say to your friend, if you love me when I'm going through this, you'd bring me chocolate? People are like, what? Hey, I like what I did. But if you're really good friend, you'd bring me chocolate. Or you might say to your spouse that you didn't buy me a Bucks jersey last week when my Bucks lost and I was depressed. You know, we might not say that. Or we might say to our, okay, that's just me talking to my, sorry. But we might say, let's say, Mom, Dad, I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed in you because when I didn't bring my homework to school that you reminded me 15 times to make sure that I bring, that you didn't take time out of your work schedule to go home and get it for me. So you must not love me, Mom or Dad. Right? So see, when we apply that principle to people, it's strange, isn't it? It's strange. Would you want to be a friend with someone who thinks you only love them when you do good things for them? Would you want that? And ultimately, is that truly a rich friendship? Or do you want a friendship with someone who's going to walk through the mess with you? See, I think that that's important. So can I love God, right? Can I love God and be confident that he loves me when I'm going through those elements, those trials? So do I believe that the faithful love of the Lord never ceases? That it never ceases. Ultimately, do I recognize that? Do I believe that? And I also love this part too. It said in that passage that God made Joseph a favorite to the warden. He made him a favorite to the warden. Now notice it doesn't say, and then the warden was like, hey, Joseph, I like you. I'm going to cut down your sentence. No. It just means, I like you. I'm going to give you responsibilities in prison, but you're still going to be in prison. But again, the favor of the Lord was still there in the midst of his suffering, in the midst of the worst. So we have to constantly remind ourselves of that. And so here's my thought too, and you can see this right on the screen. What if the answer to your prayer is not a changed situation, but a changed you? What if the answer to your prayer is not a changed situation, but a changed you? And it changed the way that you begin to look at things. So this is what's really impressive about Joseph to me as well. Because when we're at our worst, oh my goodness, sorry. My Apple Watch just asked me which Joseph. She wants to know. But when I think about Joseph, this is what's impressive to me. Because think about it. When you go through difficulties, especially when you're going through your worst, are you thinking, how can I be helpful? And if someone were to call you and say, hey, I need some help, you'd be like, so do I. Right? So Joseph is in prison, and these two guys come to him. And they say, we've had this dream, but we just don't know what it means. And Joseph basically goes to God. He prays about what these dreams are. So in the midst of his suffering, Joseph takes time to minister. He takes time to be a blessing. So he goes and he prays, and one is the chief baker, the other is a chief cupbearer. And so the chief cupbearer goes to Joseph, and Joseph gives him a really, and we're going to read it in a second, he gives him a promising outlook, like here's how things are going to work out. And then he goes to the chief baker, and he's like, dude, you're going to die. That's what your dream means. You're going to die. And he does, kind of thing. But with the chief cupbearer, so for those of you that don't know what a cupbearer is their responsibility is if someone brings a cup to Pharaoh, they drink it to make sure it's not poisoned. That's their job. And so what happens is, here's what Joseph says to the chief cupbearer. Genesis chapter 40, verse 13 through 15. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as his chief cupbearer. And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it. I did nothing to deserve it. So you interpret this dream. Hey, things are going to go well for you. It's going to work out. You're going to be restored. So when you are restored, when you're back in that place, the place of influence, the place where you have the opportunity to be able to talk to someone about what I'm going through, remember me. Remember me. Remember what I'm going through. Remember what I'm dealing with. Remember what it is that I'm facing. So imagine that you're in prison, you have this conversation, and how many times have we done this? God, that must be it. God, that must be my answer. God, you brought this person to me for me to be able to minister to them. So God, this is my door. And we begin to worship and praise God because hope is on the horizon. But then Genesis chapter 40, verse 23 says this. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. Never giving him another thought. So, again, Joseph does this incredible favor, interprets his dream, everything comes to pass, and says, bro, can you do me a solid? And the guy forgets Joseph. So now imagine Joseph. Like, you've had this hope. You've had this hope. He's gone out, things are worked out. You're assuming that he's been restored because that's what the dream said. So day one, you don't hear anything. But, he's just gotten back to his position. Maybe things. Day 3, you don't hear anything. Day 4, week 1, Month 1, month 6, you don't hear a thing. What would that do to your faith? What would that do? Can you still hold to the confidence of God's faithful love when the one that you thought was the answer, the one that you thought was going to work out, the one that you thought was going to be the means and the way, and it doesn't happen? Can you still trust God in that moment? Because again, your worst reveals the substance and makeup of your faith. So can I still trust him in my disappointment? Can I? That's the question that you have to ask. That is a situation that you have to navigate. And I want to encourage you that if you're not going through something, process that now. Work through it now before you do. And come to some conclusions about the decisions that you're going to make with your faith. And if you're going through something, because someone asked me this, and I thought it was a really great question, because I was meeting with someone, and they were saying, hey, what are you going to preach about this week? And so I talked to them about, hey, this is what I'm preaching about this week. And they asked me a really great question. And the question they asked me was, what's the determining factor? Like, why do some people have God's favor and other people suffer? Like, what's the determining factor on that? And as I thought about what I was preaching about today, I realized something. Because as we look at this passage, God's favor was still there in the midst of the suffering. See, we assume favor means, I got the check. I got the check. Woo-hoo! Favor means, my lottery number has been called. Favor means I got the car. Favor means I got the house. Favor means I got the job. Favor means things working out. So when those things are good, that God, your favor is good. But suffering means something completely different. But that's how we have determined what favor is. But when we look at this passage here, God's favor was still happening in the midst of his suffering. So don't make the mistake of only connecting favor to something good working out the way that you want it to. Favor could still be a blessing in the midst of the mess. I was driving home from El Monte, and I was disappointed because I thought this is going to be the car. It's going to work out, and all the searching and stuff would be done. And as I'm driving home, I just decided, you know what, God? I'm just going to trust you. And you have a plan for Xavier. And when the right car comes along, you're going to bring it. So I get home that day, and I look on OfferUp, and there's a brand new listing for a Scion TC in Torrance. So I reach out to the guy about the car, and I also ask him some questions, and then I have Heidi pull the Carfax for me, and the Carfax looks really good. So then we go to our mechanic, and I'm looking at the price of the car, and based on the price of the car, because we were willing to pay more for a nice Scion TC, for Xavier, but although we knew that it would still be like an 07, 08, 06, so there's still going to have to be work to be done that we'd have to pay for. So this Scion that we found was like, the guy was asking $3,900 for it. And we thought, oh, well, if we go to the mechanic, and even if it needs some work, we pay for the work. We still come out cheaper than if we had bought like a $6,000, $7,000 car. So that's the car that he has. That's the way that God worked it out. So I'm just saying all of that because, and I remember when I was driving the car, because the guy came to my house and I dropped him off somewhere and I was driving the car and I was driving back, and I remember thinking like, God, you are so good. You are so good. Then I went to AAA to register the car, and then I had to take it to get it smogged. And as I'm driving to get it smogged, I plugged my phone in to the car, for the radio, and realized his car has freaking Apple CarPlay. I know, right? I was like, God, you are good. Like, you are amazing. I was like, Xavier's going to love this element of this car. So, I was just so excited for him. So I just want to let you know that continue to hang in there. Continue to trust him. I don't know when your delivery is going to come. I don't know when it's going to work. I don't know. Especially when you look at it this way. Genesis 41:1 says this: 2 full years later. Now think about that. 2 full years later. Not just 2 years later, because that would be like, it could be like, 22 months. not approximately 2 years later. No, it was 2 full, like he had to do the full. 2 full, 24 months later, God answered his prayer and his deliverance. And next week, we're gonna talk about his deliverance. So make sure you come back next week and how that works out. But I just want to remind you, be patient. A lot of times when we read the scriptures, what we do is we read and we see like, oh my goodness, it happened. 3 chapters later, things work out, it's great. But we don't think about the timeliness. For example, God gives Abraham a promise that you're going to have a son. That promise is now fulfilled till another 25 years later. Moses goes out in the wilderness because he wants to escape Egypt. God calls Moses to let his people go kind of thing. But realize Moses was in the wilderness for 40 years. We look at Jesus. Jesus did not start his ministry until he was 30. So he lived on this earth for 30 years before he started his ministry. So what I'm saying is this, is that sometimes God's timing is not our timing. It's not. And the hard part is, can I trust you? Month 1, month 2, year 1, year 2. Can I continue to trust God that you are good? Can I trust that? Because again, his deliverance may not happen overnight, but it'll happen when the timing is right. So do we trust him, and do we trust that? So that brings us to this point. God's timing is not our timing. God's timing is not our timing. I found this really great quote that I wanted to read to you guys, and you can read the quote right on the screen with me. It says, times of waiting and not knowing are meant to foster our dependence on God and deepen our trust in him. We should always be ready to move, but in God's timing. He is the orchestrator and will be the one to open the right doors at the right time so that he may accomplish through us his perfectly timed work. So just have to trust him. Just have to trust him. And I just want to read one final passage to you. It's Habakkuk, chapter 3, verses 17 through 19. It says, and I love this, even though the fig trees have no blossoms, and there are no grapes on the vines. Even though the olive crop fails, and the fields lie empty and barren. Even though the flocks die in the fields, and the cattle barns are empty. You know what he's saying? Even when I'm broke, and there's no financial possibilities of change on the horizon. That's what he's saying. Verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes me as sure-footed as a deer, able to tread upon the heights. So with this, can we rejoice anyway? Can we trust that God's love is always faithful, that it's always there? Can we trust that God is going to walk through the challenges with us? Can we trust that? And here's one of the things I want to encourage you to make this your prayer. God, you are with me when I can't see it, feel it, doubt it, feel forgotten, and frustrated. Therefore, I will choose to praise you. What if we made that our prayer? How would that strengthen our faith? So again, here at Encounter, one of the things that we do is we love to make following God very practical. And so one of the things that Jesus said is, he said, love the Father with all you, love the Father basically with all that you have, love your neighbor as yourself. So here at Encounter, we say love up, love out, love in. And we, in every message with these principles, you can take one or you can take all that you want to apply. So love up. Love God through both the good and the bad. Love God through both the good and the bad. Love out. Find ways to be a blessing even though you are suffering. Find ways to be a blessing even though you're suffering. And then love in. Look for God's favor in the midst of suffering. Look for God's favor in the midst of suffering. God, I think